Well, apologies for me being a little late to the party, but I wanted to gather my thoughts. So, spoiler warning ahead, we're going to do minor spoilers for The Mandalorian Season 2. I'm going to try to keep the spoilers to a minimum. So, by now, most Star Wars fans have heard that Ahsoka has finally made her live action debut in The Mandalorian. Now, we did see technically her doing some guest vocal work in Rise of Skywalker, but this is her first kind of full blown appearance as a physical character live action in The Mandalorian. I'm not going to concentrate too much on the story. I'm going to briefly describe the plot. I'm going to get to the sort of main issue, which is I'm going to keep it at the level of story, not politics, as to whether Ahsoka is being sort of set up as a kind of anti-Rey within the Mandalorian and probably the larger Star Wars universe. So what happened? Well, the basic story of the Mandalorian is that he's safeguarding the child, and he finally meets this Jedi he's been seeking, and that turns out to be Ahsoka. And Ahsoka gives us some information on the child. We get its real name, we get a little bit more background. Apparently, the child has been trained thoroughly, but there's a problem. And the Mandalorian asks, well, what is it? And it's that the child has become attached to the Mandalorian. And Ahsoka says that attachment is bad. It's actually not good for Jedi. It can distort them. The Mandalorian is not aware of what's going on, but of course we know, having seen the prequels and especially Revenge of the Sith, that she's referencing Anakin and what happened with him. If you're completely new, Ahsoka was trained by Anakin, and she even faced Darth Vader. It's unclear how much of the Clone Wars or her other appearances are canon now. Filoni has made clear they're not strictly take the character as she's been done before, but we can take in broad strokes that she's probably still Anakin's student and they've encountered one another. Now, The Mandalorian is set slightly after Return of the Jedi, but it seems they're retconning various aspects of not just the child, but the timeline slightly. Now, the question turns, is this sort of a subtle attack on the sequel trilogy? I'm going to answer, I think, based on the evidence, kind of yes and no. They are clearly referencing Revenge of the Sith in a very positive way, and Filoni himself has made clear he's a really big fan of Lucas. However, there's some ironies at work here. It's well known that Lucas wanted Ahsoka killed off, and Filoni resisted that. So it's a kind of deep irony that a lot of people now like Ahsoka and compare her kind of favorably against Rey, because if Lucas had his way, we would never really have Ahsoka. Ahsoka would have a fairly relatively small storyline. So there's some weird ironies at work. So what's the case? Well, unlike Rey, Ahsoka is very stoic. She's very respectful of Jedi history. She's clearly referencing the prequel trilogy, and just the way she acts, she just lets her training do her work. She uses the double sabers and doesn't really speak in large monologues. Now, those are kind of minor points, but it is a very visible contrast to Rey, who is, kind of more snarky, talks back to everybody. And if you just look at the JJ characters, except for Sidious, there's virtually no real tie to the prequel trilogy. I think The Last Jedi is better, and it's kind of a myth that the Disney trilogy, as well as the other Disney films, don't reference the PT, but you would have to argue, I think correctly, that the PT was kind of diminished within the sequel trilogy, as well as these other saga films. There's a lot of references, but there's not a deep tie-in. But now let's get to the rumors. Is this an indication of a civil war, or even that Disney is going to decanonize the sequel trilogy? On that, I don't think there's any real good evidence. Filoni has made clear he likes Ryan. Ryan has been complimentary to Filoni. In fact, he encouraged Filoni to do live action. And there's no explicit way of trying to decanonize the sequel trilogy, and certainly not in The Mandalorian. But do I sense a slight kind of dissing or kind of a bit of insulting of Rey? I do think there is that going on. Even though Kathleen Kennedy is executive producer of The Mandalorian, she clearly is not doing the day-to-day work of creating the show. And Favreau has indicated more than once he really wants to bring back a lot of the aspects of The Phantom Menace and the prequel trilogy as a whole, and kind of Lucas's understanding of the Jedi. Now, that doesn't tell us very much because Lucas's own understanding of the Jedi keeps changing, and it's been revised several times, but I do think you'd have to agree that The Mandalorian is trying to do a lot of fan service to the prequel trilogy and to the prequel fans. And we also have to sort of come to terms with some prequel fans, not all of them, kind of define themselves in terms of their hatred or their disdain for the Disney trilogy. And obviously, the show in this episode was more aimed at them than the sequel trilogy fans. I think that's a little regrettable. I don't think that me seeing Ahsoka as a good or bad character depends on Rey. I think we can discuss both of them. I'm sort of Rey neutral. I do like a lot of aspects of the character, but I'm not obsessed with her. I don't think she's a Sue. I don't buy a lot of the mythologies about her, not training. She, earned her power without any work, etc., etc. She suffers no hardship, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think you can deny there's a huge contrast being set up between Ahsoka and Rey in terms of how they sort of fit themselves in the larger Jedi mythology, with Rey often constantly saying she doesn't really know the Jedi, she doesn't really know what happened, whereas Ahsoka is clearly well informed about at least major aspects of that history and seems very respectful of it. And The Mandalorian even ends with a kind of fan service moment referencing Thrawn, who is probably going to start appearing in later episodes of either, if not The Mandalorian, then the Ahsoka show, because it was pretty clearly set up that this appearance is sort of a lead-in to an Ahsoka series, and I've reported on that. So I'd be very surprised if an Ahsoka series is not going to be announced pretty soon. So overall, I don't see signs of a civil war, but I definitely do see signs of a kind of, not deep disagreement, but a very tactical disagreement over the various creators of how the prequel trilogy should be used. I mean, just to use one example, if you looked at the Disney films, you'd probably never guess Jar Jar was a character at all in the Star Wars universe. I mean, there's almost zero references to Jar Jar, and Jar Jar is huge in The Phantom Menace. And whatever you think about him, he is a critical character in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And even Anakin, he's referenced much more, obviously, as Darth Vader, and there's even some references to Anakin and some guest appearances here and there, but even he really doesn't play a major role, and that's pretty stunning given how central he is to the prequel trilogy. So you do see some back and forth, I think, among the creators of how to handle the prequel legacy, and I think the Mando is clearly more on the side pro-PT as opposed to the anti-PT side. So I see this more as a tactical disagreement, but there clearly is a disagreement over how to go forward in portraying not just female Jedi, but the Jedi as a whole. Alright, this has been Star Wars Analyzed on the alleged conflict between Rey versus Ahsoka in The Mandalorian Season 2. Alright, if you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Please comment below if you can. Please consider supporting the content on Patreon. Thank you for listening.